assume personality is stable, that who you are, the way you respond to conflict, to praise, to loss, to silence, is a consistent structure beneath your behavior. Psychology assumed the same thing for most of the 20th century. But what has actually been documented across multiple independent research programs is something far stranger. There exist real, measurable configurations of personality that function like blind spots in the architecture of selfhood. Traits that operate below the threshold of introspection. Patterns the person holding them cannot see, cannot report, and in some cases cannot be made to see, even under direct confrontation, even after years of intensive therapy. The first of these involves something called alexithymia, from the Greek, meaning literally, no words for feelings. This is not emotional numbness. The emotions are there. The physiological arousal is measurable. Elevated cortisol, accelerated heart rate, documented changes in skin conductance. What is absent is the cognitive bridge between the bodily state and its linguistic representation. Peter Sifnios identified this pattern in the early 1970s while working with psychosomatic patients at the Massachusetts General Hospital. What he observed was that roughly 10% of the general population and up to 50% of individuals with certain somatic disorders cannot tell you what they are feeling, not because they are hiding it, but because that translation mechanism appears to be structurally absent. Brain imaging studies using fMRI have since shown reduced functional connectivity between the anterior insula and the prefrontal cortex in alexithymic individuals. The neural pathway where bodily states are supposed to become emotional language is simply less active. The anomaly here is not the emotion, it is the disconnection. Standard models of emotional processing assume that affect and its verbal representation travel together, that feeling and knowing you feel are parts of the same system. In alexithymia, they are not. The person might grip the table harder in a tense conversation and have no idea why. They might develop a migraine the morning of an important event and describe themselves as fine. The body is keeping score, a phrase borrowed from Bessel van der Kolk's 2014 synthesis of trauma research, while the narrative self has no access to the tally. And this is not rare. A 2008 meta-analysis published in the journal Brain and Cognition estimated alexithymia prevalence in the general population at between 8 and 17%, with higher rates in males, in individuals on the autism spectrum, and in those with histories of early attachment disruption. A second configuration is harder to name and harder to study. The phenomenon known in psychopathology as schizotypy. Not schizophrenia, not psychosis, but a measurable personality dimension, distributed continuously across the population, like height or blood pressure. That includes magical ideation, perceptual aberrations, and ideas of reference, meaning the persistent low-grade sense that unrelated events in the environment are somehow personally meaningful. Gordon Claridge at Oxford spent decades developing psychometric instruments to measure schizotypy not as a disorder, but as a trait. And what his data consistently showed was that the population does not divide cleanly into psychotic and not psychotic. Instead, schizotypal traits appear in roughly 10 to 15% of the general population at subclinical levels, not causing functional impairment, but shaping how those individuals process randomness, coincidence, and causality. They are more likely to find patterns in noise, more likely to trust intuition over evidence, and, in a finding that remains scientifically contested, more likely to score higher on measures of creative cognition. This is where the model breaks down in an interesting direction. The traditional psychiatric framework treats schizotypal ideation as protopathology, a risk factor, a prodrome, a warning sign. But the dimensional model proposed by Claridge and supported by subsequent genome-wide association studies suggests that what we call schizotypy may be an evolved cognitive style that trades reliability of inference for breadth of association. The same genetic variants associated with psychosis risk are also associated with higher rates of artistic and creative achievement in first-degree relatives of people with schizophrenia, a finding replicated in a 2015 study from the Decode Genetics project in Iceland involving over 80,000 participants. This does not make psychosis adaptive. It makes the genetic architecture more complex than the clinical model accounts for. The trait and the disorder may share a substrate without sharing a destiny. A third pattern has no clean clinical name, but has been documented in the behavioral literature under the label acquired situational narcissism, a phrase coined by psychiatrist Robert Millman in the early 2000s to describe a configuration of self-focus and empathic failure that does not originate in early development, as classic narcissistic personality disorder is theorized to, but appears to develop in adulthood in response to sustained social environments where normal corrective feedback has been removed. Millman's observation, drawn initially from clinical work with celebrities and executives, was that prolonged exposure to environments of unchallenged status produces measurable changes in social cognition, reduced perspective taking, increased tendency toward attributing others' intentions as instrumental, decreased ability to register or retain information about other people's emotional states. The personality has not always been this way. The environment reshaped it. The neuroscience here points to the prefrontal subcortical circuits involved in social cognition, specifically the temporoparietal junction, which plays a central role in theory of mind, the capacity to model what another person is thinking or feeling. Studies using repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation to temporarily disrupt TPJ function produce, in healthy volunteers, a measurable reduction in moral judgment accuracy and social inference. They behave, for a brief window, in ways that resemble reduced empathy. Millman's clinical hypothesis, though never formally subjected to a randomized controlled trial, has since found partial support in longitudinal studies of power and social perception conducted by Dasher Keltner at Berkeley, whose lab demonstrated across multiple paradigms that elevated social power reliably reduces the accuracy of emotional face recognition and increases reliance on stereotyped rather than individuated social judgments. What these findings collectively suggest is that the personality trait we call empathy is not purely fixed at development. It may be continuously maintained or eroded by the social structure you inhabit. A fourth configuration is among the most documented and the least understood: the phenomenon of overexcitability, described by Polish psychiatrist and psychologist Kazimierz Dąbrowski in his theory of positive disintegration, developed from the 1960s onward through clinical and biographical analysis of highly creative and intellectually gifted individuals. Dąbrowski proposed 5 distinct modes of heightened sensitivity: psychomotor, sensual, intellectual, imaginative, and emotional, each representing not a disorder, but an intensified channel of experiencing. Individuals with high emotional overexcitability, for instance, do not merely feel emotions more intensely. They report feeling multiple contradictory emotions simultaneously, feeling others' emotional states as though they were their own, and experiencing what Dąbrowski called the feeling of feelings, a meta-emotional awareness that can become debilitating. These are not clinical diagnoses. They are phenomenological observations from case studies and interview data. The difficulty with Dąbrowski's framework is that it sits at the boundary between clinical psychology and philosophy of mind, and has proven resistant to the kinds of operationalization that would allow clean empirical testing. Attempts to develop psychometric measures of overexcitability, including Michael Piechowski's overexcitability questionnaire, have produced instruments with adequate test-retest reliability, but contested construct validity. What the data cannot resolve is whether overexcitability represents a genuinely distinct psychological trait, or simply the high end of existing dimensions like neuroticism, openness to experience, and sensory processing sensitivity, which have far more robust empirical foundations. Elaine Aron's research on the highly sensitive person, a construct developed independently in the 1990s and since validated in over 30 peer-reviewed studies, overlaps substantially with Dąbrowski's emotional overexcitability, and fMRI studies show that individuals scoring high on Aron's sensitivity scale show greater activation in the insular and anterior cingulate cortex in response to both positive and negative social stimuli. But whether this represents a discrete type or a continuous dimension remains unresolved. A fifth anomaly involves what researchers in clinical psychology have called emotional detachment with preserved relational intelligence, a pattern observed in individuals who score low on self-reported affect and high on social cognition batteries. These are people who can accurately predict how others will feel, interpret facial microexpressions with above-average accuracy, and model social dynamics with considerable precision, while reporting minimal personal emotional engagement with any of it. This is not the profile of psychopathy. which is associated with deficits in fear recognition and reduced autonomic response to distress cues. These individuals show normal autonomic baselines. What they appear to lack is not the capacity for social understanding, but the motivational valence that normally attaches to it. They understand the emotional landscape of the room without being moved by it. Researchers studying this pattern have struggled to place it within existing nosology. It does not meet criteria for any DSM-5 disorder, yet it constitutes a genuine and consistent configuration that appears in roughly 3 to 5% of clinical referrals for relationship difficulties. A sixth pattern has accumulated substantial empirical support, but continues to generate theoretical controversy. The phenomenon of counterdependency, sometimes called compulsive self-reliance, documented in attachment research as a stable adult attachment style characterized not merely by emotional distance, but by a deeply automated resistance to needing others, even under conditions of genuine threat or distress. In Philip Shaver and Mario Mikulincer's extensive research on adult attachment, spanning over 200 published studies across 3 decades, dismissing avoidant individuals do not simply choose independence. They show physiological suppression of attachment-related distress. When exposed to attachment threat in laboratory paradigms, their self-reported distress is low, but their cortisol levels, skin conductance, and cardiovascular reactivity tell a different story. The need is there. The signal is there. But the behavioral and phenomenological system has been configured through early relational experience to mute the awareness of it. The person genuinely does not know they are distressed. Their introspective report is not a lie. It is a structural inaccessibility. The seventh and perhaps most structurally strange personality configuration documented in the literature involves what has been observed in certain individuals following lesions to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. The region Antonio Damasio and his colleagues at the University of Iowa systematically studied throughout the 1990s using a population of patients with focal neurological damage. These individuals lose what Damasio called the somatic marker function, the capacity for emotional signals to bias decision-making toward favorable outcomes. They retain full intellectual function. Their IQ is intact. Their verbal reasoning, working memory, and abstract problem-solving are unimpaired. But they cannot make even simple decisions in a timely or consistent way. Choosing between 2 restaurants becomes a 40-minute exercise. Long-term planning collapses. And crucially, they show no emotional response to scenarios that should provoke one, not because they cannot understand the scenario intellectually, but because the body-based signal that would normally weight the options has been severed. The somatic marker hypothesis remains one of the few theories in effective neuroscience that generated a specific testable prediction, the Iowa gambling task, and produced replicable results across dozens of independent labs. What none of these configurations share is a single point of failure. They are not all emotional problems, or social deficits, or executive function disorders. They are diverse structural arrangements, some developmental, some acquired, some genetic, some environmentally shaped, some located in specific neural circuits and some distributed across systems, that produce individuals who deviate from the personality model psychology has built. And what psychology has built, largely, are models of the average, tested on convenient samples, validated against self-report, and generalized with a confidence the data has never fully earned. The open question is not whether these configurations exist. The data are clear that they do. The open question is whether our taxonomies, the DSM, the 5-factor model, attachment theory, the entire architecture of personality psychology, are capable of holding them. Because what each of these anomalies suggests, independently and together, is that the mind is generating solutions to the problem of being alive, that the models were not built to accommodate. And researchers are still, right now, determining whether the framework needs a revision or a replacement.